Good morning, brothers and sisters. In the month of May, the staff will be sending out quiet time materials to all members of the church, as well as to our friends who are interested. For each of the quiet time session, we have split it up into two sections. The first one is called Exploring the Surface, and that is catered for those who are studying the Bible, or even for those of us who wish to brush up our basics. The second section is for the older disciples and is called Digging Deeper. I ask that each of you to take these quiet times seriously, do them every day, so that together we can move as a church. This quiet time series is based entirely on the book of Mark. And just to kick off the study on this book, last week's sermon on the cross and resurrection was centered on it. And today's sermon will also be focused on the cross, also taken from the book of Mark, but from a different angle. So let me start by giving you a little background on the book of Mark. It's now an accepted view among scholars that Mark was the first gospel to be written, and was composed around AD 55 to 65. Now, as I mentioned last week, it was likely to have been written by Peter the Apostle, but it was Mark who actually penned it down. Now, there are compelling reasons that Peter was the primary author. First of all, there were many intricate details that could have come from a witness who was part of Jesus' inner circle. Secondly, Mark was also a close associate of Peter. And so from this, we shall assume that Peter was the primary author, although he was assisted by Mark. Now, one of the striking themes in this book is the amount of space Peter and Mark set aside to talk about the cross. And I didn't realize this until I began my study on this book. For example, out of the 16 chapters in this short book, the cross was not referred to directly or indirectly in only 6 chapters. Chapters 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 13. That means in the remaining 10 chapters, the cross was talked about either directly or indirectly. And that's about 63%. So 63% of the book was alluded to either directly or indirectly about the cross. And that's more than any of the other 3 Gospels. So this prompted a question. Why was there so much emphasis on the cross in this book? Why did both Peter and Mark made so much space in this book to talk about the cross? Well, I think more than anything, firstly, the message of the cross was and is the core of the good news of Jesus Christ. Peter wanted the whole Roman world to know about the good news, and there was no way he could have done so without conveying the message of the cross. But here's the odd thing. The cross was not a subject that people were drawn to talk about at that time. In fact, any story about the cross repelled people from talking about it. And yet, the early Christian message to the Roman world was that the cross was the means through which God came close to man. So the cross was a very perplexing message to the Roman world. And yet this perplexing message attracted so many in the first century. And the Christian faith spread like a tidal wave. Now, not everybody gets the cross. In Mark 16 verse 40, it says here that some women were watching the crucifixion from a distance. To borrow this phrase, I feel today that many of us also have a distant view of the cross. Well, why is that? I think some of us feel that this event took place a long time ago, and so they somehow feel very detached to it. But apart from that, many also do not feel connected to God on an emotional level through the cross. Now, what is interesting is that Peter, who responded to the initial call to follow Jesus, also had a distant view of the cross to begin with. And we shall see, as he matured, he finally had an up-close and personal experience with God through Jesus. And that eventually shaped him to be the man that he had become. So this journey of Peter, how he viewed the cross initially from a distance, but later having an up-close and personal grasp and experience, is what this study is all about. So I entitled this message, The Cross, Up Close and Personal. So let's begin our study by going through the chapters in which the cross was alluded to. Remember, about 60% of the book was alluded to the cross, either directly or indirectly. The first appearance of it was found in Mark chapter 2. So let's all go there. Mark chapter 2, beginning verse 18 to 20. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?" Jesus answered, "How can the guest of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast." Well, who do you think was the bridegroom that Jesus was referring to? I believe he was referring to himself. And he was referring to the fact that one day he, the bridegroom, would be taken away. And that was what he meant. He was alluding, I believe, to the cross. Over in chapter 3, verse 5 to 6, we read these words. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. So you see here again in chapter 3, very earlier on in the book, Peter remembered that people were already plotting to take his life. As we know, that happened at the cross. Over in Mark chapter 8, in verse 31 to 33. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." So by the time we reach chapter 8, Jesus was a lot more direct. He was talking very plainly that he was going to suffer and die, and on the third day rise again. Over in Mark chapter 9, again, the cross was alluded to. Beginning in verse 12 and 13, we read these words. Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it is written about it. Again, Jesus was very, very direct about the cross. So up to this point, you can see there was quite a few instances. Both Peter and Mark made space in their book to talk about the cross. Over in chapter 9, we see this theme coming out again and again. Verse 30 to 32. They left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were, because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." But they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. Peter, along with the other 11, did not understand what Jesus had meant. And Peter was remembering that. Now, here's an interesting phrase that kind of, hit me. When Jesus says the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. That phrase, hands of men, that struck me. Because so many times we think our fate is in the hands of men, don't we? We believe that the fate of our job is in the hands of men. The fate of our role in the church, perhaps, is in the hands of men. And yet, Jesus, while he referred to the fact that he was going to be handed over into the hands of men, knew all too well that God was in control, that God was indeed orchestrating everything. Over in Mark chapter 9, verse 35, we read these words. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all." And I believe this is also a passage that was alluding to the cross. Jesus was a servant of all. The cross was a clear demonstration that he took the last position, so to speak. Over in Mark chapter 10, verse 32 to 35. They were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. "We're going up to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man will be delivered over to chief priests and teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise." Here, a very clear reference to the cross in Mark chapter 10. Then again, later on in that chapter, in verse 45, we read these words. "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." This verse in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, is viewed by many as the central scripture for the entire book of Mark. In other words, if you could sum up the entire book of Mark into one verse, what would it be? It would be verse 45. To give up his life as a ransom for many. And when did that happen? The cross. Do you see how much space here that Peter and Mark set aside to talk about the cross? It is astounding. Mark chapter 11, the chief priests and teachers of the law, in verse 18, heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. Again, another allusion to the cross. Then Mark chapter 12, from verse 1 to 12, is all about the parable of the tenants. I won't read the whole parable. But essentially, that whole parable is about the cross. It's about the tenants killing the son of the owner of the vineyard. And that was obviously him. In Mark chapter 14, when Jesus was anointed by the woman, again, he alluded to his death. In verse 8, Jesus said, "She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial." There you go, another reference to his death. And then, finally, from Mark chapter 15 all the way to the end of the book, there was a very detailed account of the crucifixion and the resurrection. So, we've kind of went through the book of Mark very briefly. Do you see how much space Peter and Mark set aside for the cross? Now, this is interesting because when you think about creating that much space for the cross, I wonder in our own lives and in our own thinking, how much space do we create for the cross? In other words, brothers, is the cross just a Sunday ritual for you? You come, you take communion, you think about the cross, and then it's over. You leave, and it's business as usual until the next week. And to me, when I studied the book of Mark and came to the conclusion of the amount of space that both Peter and Mark set aside for the cross, I was deeply moved because I realized I've got to do better than that. Because usually I just don't end up doing that. There are many times in my own life when other things would consume me. You know, when you run a ministry and you have a huge responsibility, you start thinking about how to make the church more efficient, how to get on top of everything. You know, there were times when we got so caught up with statistics and finding out how many people came to church and this and that, and you get so caught up in the numbers that the cross stays at the background. And then you don't really make that much space for it. And then what happens? Well, I think your heart gets hard. But I think the one theme or lesson we can get from this book is that we need to create space in our lives for the cross. Well, let's look at Peter. How did he view the cross? When he was following Jesus, what was his mindset? You know, in Mark chapter 8, remember when Jesus spoke very plainly that he was going to suffer? The Bible says in verse 32, so we read these words, he spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So did Peter understand the cross? No. You have to also ask, why did Peter rebuke Jesus at this point? I believe it was because right after Jesus spoke very clearly that he was going to suffer, Peter knew that as his follower, he would also have to suffer. And I don't think he was ready for that. So he rebuked Jesus and told Jesus, let's change our plans or do something else. He rebuked Jesus, and then Jesus rebuked him back. You got to think twice before you rebuke Jesus. So here was Peter. He followed Jesus, but the cross meant suffering. And to Peter, he wasn't quite ready to embrace that. Look over in Mark chapter 9, verse 31 to 34. This was right after Jesus spoke very clearly about the fact that he was going to suffer. Okay? Mark 9, verse 31 to 34. Okay? I've already read that passage, but I want you to go there, because I want to show you something. Right after that passage, okay, it says here in verse 33, this is just before that, you will see that Jesus spoke about the fact that he was going to be delivered in the hands of men. And then in verse 33, they came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" They kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. So Jesus spoke about the cross, but they missed it. The cross was at a distance. So what consumed Peter and the other 11? They were more consumed about who was the greatest. So Jesus spoke about the cross. Right after that, they were consumed about who was the greatest. Over in Mark chapter 10, verse 33 to 34, I thought this was interesting. Again, Jesus was talking about the cross. From verse 33 to 34. And then in verse 35 to 37, the scene changed. Because it says here, then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left in your glory." Wow. He just spoke about the cross in verse 33 to 34. And in verse 35, they went completely off track and asked Jesus if he would let them sit on his left and on his right. See how easy it is to miss the cross. It's so easy to let the cross be at a distance instead of coming and having an up-close and personal experience with God. In Mark chapter 14, verse 53, it says here, they took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right in the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. Isn't that interesting that Peter, as he talked to Mark about that incident, that the phrase that he had Mark penned down was this: Peter followed him at a distance. That really summed up how Peter was at that point. And this was after he had followed Jesus for 3 full years. I mean, walking with the Son of God in flesh and blood. And he still didn't quite get the cross. Does that speak to us as well, brothers and sisters? We come to church, and for so many of us, in our hearts, we want to do what's right. We want to follow God. We want to put him first. But we also battle a lot with our sinful nature. And so the Christian life is constantly a battle against doing, a battle to do what's right and to put our evil side, and keep it at bay. And so there is a tremendous battle that we go through. Now, I understand that this is part and parcel of following Jesus. But if you view the cross at a distance, then that's really how you're going to be for the rest of your life. The cross has to mean a lot more to us. For Peter, he changed. He absolutely changed. The cross was no more. He didn't view the cross at a distance. He allowed God's love to really, really enter into his heart. He internalized it and became so much a part of his makeup and his thinking. And that's why when he wrote the book of Mark, the cross was all over the place. He made so much space for the cross. I want to show you something else. Let's look at the book of 1 Peter. This book was written also by Peter. Okay? So let's flip over to the book of 1 Peter. And now let's look at the theme in this book and see how much he referred to the cross. So look over in chapter 1, verse 2. Who have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, to be obedient to Jesus Christ and sprinkled with his blood. Wow. Right at the onset of the book of 1 Peter, there was a mention of the cross. Then in verse 11, still in chapter 1, 1 Peter, trying to find out the time and circumstances to which the Spirit of Christ in them was pointing when he predicted the sufferings of the Messiah and the glories that would follow. This is just in chapter 1. Then in verse 19, for you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you by your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. Chapter 2, verse 23. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. Chapter 3, verse 18. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. Chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. Chapter 4, verse 13. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. Finally, chapter 5, verse 1. To the elders among you I appeal as a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's sufferings, who also will share in the glory to be revealed. So how much space did Peter make for the cross from a person who was tempted to look at his role from a humanistic point of view? He wanted to be the greatest. to a point where he made so much room for the cross when he authored the book of Mark and First Peter. I say, brothers and sisters, he changed. He moved from having a distant view of the cross to one that was up close and personal. And it changed him. It changed him. And so it came out in everything that he wrote. So I want to ask you, brothers and sisters, right now, do you make space in your life, in your thinking, in your everyday responsibility? Do you think about the cross? Or is the cross a once-a-week ritual? And if that's all the cross is to you, that's really the only time you think about it, then the Christian life is just going to be that much more challenging. And it's going to be an uphill climb. But if you really have an up-close and personal experience of the cross, and you internalize it and understand how much God loves you, and that your life is simply a response to that, life as a Christian will take on a whole new meaning. You will live every day with thanksgiving and gratitude. I understand it's easier said than done, and I've had my own struggles, but this is something I've come to realize, that I've got to be closer and closer to the cross. I've got to have an up-close and personal experience.